So the present situation seems to be predominantly characterized by people being very suspicious. They're suspicious of authorities. They're suspicious of what to believe in. They're not sure about institutions. They're getting, and it's partly a function of the information age. So what preceded the information age, the parents, the grandparents' age, is known as the industrial age, the modern industrial age of democracy and so on. And there was less saturation of information. We began to then move after the war, after the 50s, after the 70s, into various forms of media. And so we developed more and more outlets of information, generation of information and computers. And then accessibility got democratized. So there was more access to that information as the information was amplified. So we then we pronounce that the information age. With the information age, you're most likely then to see the occurrence of this proliferation of what's called the sort of interpretive imperative, that facts aren't simply facts. A fact is not a fact. A fact is made up of bits of perception. So in an information age, we zoned in on that phenomenon, which in science we call phenomenology. The ability to break down into constituent parts how worldviews are formed by the phenomenon of perception. So the information age is about perceptibility and how we process that perceptibility. And that proliferated, it produced a proliferation objectively.
Right.
That means different standpoints, viewpoints. Standpoints as in a viewpoint, a point from which you view, creates the perception. So that truth seems to be orbital, nomadic, on the move. Whereas in the pre-information age, it seemed to be more stable. The localability of it is now spurious and dubious because we're not really trusting the institutions. So the church, the state, the courts, the police, etc., they are outlets, but they're not necessarily seen as outlets of truth-telling. They're just outlets of fact-building, which is to impress upon you perceptions. So people are not that dumb. They're beginning to understand that that involves a process. And we could refer to that as a constructive or a construction process. How is information dealt with and produced by agents, by entities? So journalists are just one amongst many, but the whole digital workers, the whole digital industry and their workers now play equal roles to the former journalists of the information age marked by the newspaper. That's now almost gone.
How do we discern what is true, what is not? How do we make the leap?
So that's the problem of phenomenology, that the agent, the human being as agent, is involved in the making of their own phenomenology, and the institutions that are there to make information, and there is a gap between the two. With the democratization, which means the universal dissemination of knowledge, information now is at the ready hands, the ready fingers of any one individual, regardless of their background. So we call that democratization or leveling. As a result of that, every phenomenological outlook of the human being is seen as valid. So rather than starting with, as the old thinkers did, the philosophers, first beginning with truth somewhere out there, in phenomenology it seems as though we are sanctioned to begin with what they call the understanding of what may be out there as a fact. So a fact would be that the climate is unstable and it has something to do with carbon, an excess of carbon in the atmosphere. But that has to be understood, and that involves a process. And it's a democratic process where every individual performs an act of apprehending, grasping it, holding it. Because of that, there is a greater want to philosophize, even though citizens don't think they are philosophizing, by constructing their own perception self-consciously and knowing that outlets of information, such as institutions, New York Times, CNN, BBC, whatever, are susceptible, duplicable, fallible, what metaphysicians call the case of the limit. Whereas before, the great-grandparents would just take the word of the BBC or the Times and just take it as it is. Reportage was considered merely in terms of the fasticity of the facts. It is taken true because it is factually true. Now we know that there is truth beyond the factual. Truth is greater, and this is quite correct philosophically, that truth is more than the sum of facts. And most citizens, highly educated, less so educated, and hardly educated, regardless, in a democratic period, the information age, understand that anyone can manipulate statistics. Anyone is able to be involved in the construction from data. So you gather data, and from data you construct the fact. So this comes from Latin. When you're in the West, it comes from Latin. Datum, which is more raw, develops into, with the involvement of human perception and gathering, a sense of gather, the phenomenon, into factum. So datum, it then becomes factum. But data, like if I give you, for example, 10 timelines of the local bus arriving, 10:52, 11:10, 11:10, they are bytes of information. But that's not a fact. That's a datum piece. So they are fragments. We assay and we assemble the fragments of datum to then forge one single whole bit, which is then a factum. And the difference with the bus line example, to have a fact is that the bus, every Thursday, the bus has a pattern, and according to the pattern, it should arrive at my bus stop at 11:10. You can hypothesize, you can predict. That's more than raw data. Raw data is to be merely assembled. So that constructive process,
which I guess unfolds in all arenas of life,
all
whether
arenas,
it be marketing, if it's political campaigning, regardless, it's all constructive.
So when I say information age, I mean also that it's not the spread of information, the number of outlets, it's that more modes of living and more modes of production are information rich. So living at home, you might have Google set up in the house. You have your Wi-Fi and your settings. Everything now has more information than your great-grandparents had. They just had a kitchen. Some didn't have electricity. There was just plumbing, maybe. So now we irrigate informatically. House outside the household, it's ubiquitous. So it's not merely institutional. In a democratized information age, you bring down to the micro-capillary action where that datum converts into factum. So it's beyond now the BBC tower, the tower in London. In London, the BBC has a tower. It's beyond the tower. It's beyond New York City having the Times. It's at your disposable. Information age means readily at hand, as Heidegger would put it. At your fingertips is there, the information. And so not only in theory, theoretically, but actually through the phone now, the mini computer on your hand is information rich. So you're carrying like global data sets within your 4 or 5 fingers, and you're saying datum, to then download factum, to then create perception, to then make your own phenomenology. And from there, the leap you will then ask from your first question, you then leap to what we now call from the Germans and the Greeks, judgment. So once you have that phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenology of perception, once you have gathered that, it's all right, how does it then fit into the worldview? Is the FBI self-interested? The question that you raise, what's the FBI doing in its factum modality? Is it security obsessed? Is it defending the state mechanism of the United States, the nation state of that, the UN body or the EU body? Are they self-interested? Are they acting egoistically? Are they preserving their power? The phenomenology, which remember draws on rich sites, rich modalities, is having to form judgments for the self now, not merely for the family or the church or tradition. So it's more atomization through what's called, in liberal thought, it's called individuation. The individual is now atomic or atomized, and it's up to her, him, it, to do the gathering, weigh up the various array of factum, forge together, and then form a worldview, this Weltanschauung, form its own worldview, and then say, I don't think I will watch BBC anymore. I don't trust them. The advance is this in the information age. We are now decoupled. We're now delinked from major bodies, major institutions. So when you're on IG, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc., like I said, it's now in the power of your own hand, in your own control. You now become an instigator. All the uploads and all the comments you can type in, you are now like a pseudo-journalist. You are now producing material. You can produce videos, you can bring in all kinds of material from all video, electronic, etc., of landscapes or a letter you wrote, or you can type a comment, etc. So you're a producer, creator. So the individuum of the atom, of the I, is now empowered. In the information age, seems to disempower the old bodies, the old arcane institutions, and shifting the power center to moi, to the self, and that would be an advance, morally, ethically, judgmentally. The flip side now, the problem with it's the errancy with that is to then hold that I only trust what I, as other selves who are removed, and therefore the trusts. So with empowerment comes the ability to trust again, but to trust in these individual modes of production, while also manufacturing large-scale distrust of anything societal, cultural, global, civilizational.
Right. So where is the binding for a culture, a civilization, a planet, if we're having this fragmentation process?
Prevailing at the moment, the binding is that if I have freedom, I'm allowed to do what I can do. So the democracy almost reinforces its tautology, which means that as we are empowered, and the little man, the little citizen, is the fulcrum of all things, there's nothing beyond him, her, the self, and that's all there is. So we don't need God, we don't need custom ritual, we don't need rituals, we don't need temples, we don't need customary ways, we don't need tribal manners. It's the appealing sway of self-authorization. I am now the author of my own making. something that comes from someone like Goethe, Rilke, Nietzsche, Taylor, Coleridge, Samuel Coleridge, that the fashioning of the self is the fashioning of the world. This is a Shakespearean motif, basically. And that seems to work in a democratic age, that we put value, we invest the value in the self making, producing its own value. So we're machinic. We are the machines, we are the producers of value. And the old center points of value creation are now duplicable. And so while we're empowering and inflating our empowers, we have to remember in falsity that we are also, this is a truth statement, we're also inflating or expanding the realm of skepticism. So we're manufacturing mass skepticism whilst we are self-authorizing. So what was formerly for Tom Paine, Benjamin Franklin, freedom, here is now my freedom, my post-liberal freedom, because it's information saturate and I'm now the author of my own saturation. This is what happens. I open up my phone first thing in the morning and I'm spammed. So I get very identical requests, voicemail, messages, banks pretending to be banks, pretending, etc. Vocal or non-vocal, recorded or not recorded, message like written in script or not, and it's fake or it's spam. You've got bots now spinning them out. So now we have to be extra hyper alert and discerning to distinguish. This is what was in the old days once liberty for John Stuart Mill, Hamilton, and all those people. What was once liberty is now no longer that I'm unencumbered, thus I am free. It is that I must now discriminate very discernibly between bots and actual users, between real messages and spam. Recordings, because in saturated, rich information age, the suspect actors, world actors, which used to be only the mafia before or something criminal, now it's at your very fingertip, they are there. They are using the same mechanisms as you are in your vision of being free to access you. So your freedom is producing your own unfreedom dialectically, and that's the paradox.
So dialectically, how does freedom from unfreedom, we saw the movement, but what is dialectic? Simply, very simply.
That you are instantaneously entwined with the opposite of you. So male is to female. Your daylight is entwined into your nightlight. Your head brainiac space is entwined with your heart and your heart-feeling body. Reason is entwined with instinct. And this entwinement means that when you posit, when you put forward something, we call it a positing. So I posit that, for instance, the world is mathematical. There is the other case, or its antithesis. It's non. So not is, but it's non. So postulate was it is mathematical. It's contrary, what Immanuel Kant calls its antinomy, after the Greek. Its antinomy, its seeming opposite, is no, there is a non-mathematical world out there. So Narnia, for example, elicits feelings. So the other voice comes in and says, but hold on, isn't C.S. Lewis also producing the non-mathematical world structure? And you say, so a physicist, for example, incorrectly held, Paul Dirac, everything in the cosmos, our world, can simply be summed up by numbers. Is reducible to numbers. If you want to say, well, when I bought flowers from my dear mother and she cried when she saw the flowers, is her crying a mathematical geometric theorem or proof? As C.S. Lewis would say, no, it's impossible. So in the dialectic, there's entanglement in that argumentation, in that exchange of viewpoints. They lock in. And the two propositional contents, they can clash, but the point is that they engage. So Socrates makes the lead into what is a dialectic. And he shows that whilst you propose something, A, it's non-A, B, namely B, is within your A. It's just that you're not aware of it. You had to have the encounter with B to find that B resides within your actual A, and similarly, A resides similarly within your actual B. So just when I thought it's after midnight and it's all AM, your PM is also within your AM. They are dialectically interdependent, interlocked. So let us say dialectically, what allows us to produce discernibility has a prerequisite. The precondition is susceptibility of all things. Morally, we call that distrust. If all things are now susceptible to examination, critical examination, I am now suspicious of the policeman shooting George. That in itself has a precursor. So it's dialectical precursor. Before that, say in your parents' generation, was when it was indubitable and people trusted. They trusted, but they were still getting conned. So while there was trust and there was feeling goodness, there was good feeling because you bought the Times off the tube, you come out of the tube and you just buy The Guardian, the Times, and your heart, more than your mind, was with it because you're a loyal Guardian reader. Yes, it's cozy, the world is warm, and you're living in trust. You don't have that cynicism of the information age. However, The Guardian or the Times constructed the front page news for you. So you're just getting fed. So you're lesser than in the information age where you don't expect to be fed, but you get up in the morning and as you open up, log in, you are making it. You're not being fed. So you might go onto Twitter for a few minutes as authorial self and just leave out watching BBC TV because that's at you. They're coming at you on social media. Rather, you are instigating the move. You are the initiator. Nothing is coming at you. And because you can discern the followers, and you might say, yes, but you're streaming. Yes, but you're discerning and deciding which ones should come into your feed and your stream. So that they aren't exactly coming at you. The loyal Guardian reader succumbed to let them come at me because the editor has made all the decisions for what I will be exposed to. There's no editorial process here.
So with this responsibility essentially descending back into the individuals, that's an enormous leap.
Yeah. That basis is in a philosophical system that goes back 200 years. And we liken it to, it doesn't really start there. It starts in the French, what is called the French Enlightenment and the German Enlightenment. And it finds its sort of apex around 1796 and in a very widely respected German philosopher who had an enormous influence called Immanuel Kant. And so he writes, it's a very thin, very, very tiny, short paper, more like an essay, What is Enlightenment? And from the French into him, we feed it into a sort of worldview that's is determined and discerned as liberal, a liberal outlook, that the self not only should be unencumbered, and not only is a creature of God, etc., in the Enlightenment, they are creatures of God, but that the bearing of responsibility comes with every right. So the more rights you adorn the citizen with, they are also similarly adorned with so many responsibilities. So you're both, it's not considered a weighing down like a weight of responsibilities. It's more that what was once given to a bishop or a priest or a master of the college, now you too, little Betty, little petty John and Betty, are similarly as authorial, because with authority comes great, and Nietzsche said, with great freedom comes great responsibility.
And so this vesting of freedom brings with it its concomitant growing pains. If we are children, we're teething, literally. And as this responsibility is sort of erupting through the gums of the culture, it's painful. There are problems. This is the suspect stuff. This is all of that.
And so what's the point of that? Because a Kierkegaard, a Dostoevsky would say, and? In other words, of course. And what's the implicit judgment in the supposing, called a supposition, that suffering is, it's a word, but as a semantic piece, like what? Well, of course. And that's part of life. And skepticism is a part of life. Being conned, being duped by other authorities. You can diminish it, but it's part of life. Wanting to trust when you only have distrust is part of life. So we do suffer. It's the nature of the beast. So in dialectics, every moment or every stance, every conditioned cultural state, every stance, therein lies the possibility of overcoming, what's called overcoming. And so the agent, in a sense, is always overcoming herself and renewing and renewing themselves in form. So there always is, in any instantiation, the possibility to be more. And how does one do that? So we don't say with Sauron, or we don't say with Leo Tolstoy, that this is it and so it shall forever be. No, in dialectics there is no for it shall thus ever be. That's too fatalistically determined. It's that in all presences, in all presence, there is a contradiction, because that dynamic I explained earlier, therein lies within contradictions. So I gave you one before that it seems paradoxical. Unfreedom, freedom. Saturation, producing... See, with saturation, we want to get away and have some solitude and quiet because it's all white noise. So we want it to authorize ourselves, but we're also overwhelmed by all the noise of social media. So they're the paradoxical dimensions. And dialectical thinking grasps that, shows how it becomes contradictory, and the contradiction will then produce the new relation between what's known as like the self and the other, or the I and the not I, the inner and the outer, the future and the present. All those instances or moments in German, like moments, they will percolate through up into space and time and demand your attention. So you've got responsibility and you have freedom, but it's also being attentive phenomenologically.
And this is surging through anyone, everyone, all
Anyone,
the time.
everyone, every act, every non-act, every silence, every noise, every light, every darkness. Yeah. So that, you might wonder, but how does the dialectic term that, name that? And we call that the infinite. So infinite is there, and dialectical is the slave. Infinity is the master, and its slave, what does its work on the planet, on the surface of the planet, is dialectical reason and dialectical action. So the two are Hegel. Hegel talks about dialectical reason and dialectical action, praxis. And then Karl Marx, following a student of his, will follow and do the same, two registers. So you don't wake up and say, well, which button do I press to subscribe? It's not a click. You are my friend. You, she, he, Jane, Betty. They are necessarily in the dialectical process because they come under the heading, under the aegis of the infinitum. So remember, on the net and whatever sort of medium you use, you're both creature, that means subject to, or receiver. I would say receiver, not subject to. You're both creature, but you're also creator. So the proper notion of a God or a transcendent supreme one is the same as you and I. They are both creator and creature or being. So we too. So as God would create, we create, and the antithesis of creator is creature. So the human animal is a creature. That means that we come under the umbrage of infinity, but we live in finitude. We are temporal, we are finite, we are fallible, we are self-interested, egoic creatures, etc. That's the creatorial creature. But yet, paradoxically, which in dialectics is perfectly fine, right? It's not a one-sided argument. We say, oh, this produces a paradox. It must be two-sided, but they're in cahoots. They're in sort of some sort of order. That the creature, see, in a sense, the creature creates the conditions by which you will feel it as a creator. Like you're one and the same, you're two-sided, heads and tails coin. You're both creator and creature. So when the creature, something seeps into her from without, it seeps into her, it's from the forces of all the other creatures around her. So other users on Twitter, for her to receive it, they are her creators. And for them, she's their creature or listener. So we use terms like listener, speaker, producer, consumer. It's the same dialectic. One that receives and one that gives out. So creature gives out, puts out, it's an output, puts out. And then the creature, what was called before slave, master and slave, the creature is subject to that putting out and then receives. So I get tweets on my feed because others created those tweets. And they'll receive mine because they are creatures to me. And that's what I called earlier entwinement. It's not a word. It's a dynamic and a process. And by the way, you feel it. So it impacts on you. It's a feeling thing too. Sensuous.
So is feeling then, this is not merely intellectual. It's not locked up in the head somehow.
Yeah.
This is a full spectrum.
So when we said before phenomenology, it's your whole being. And you might say, well, what is that? And so we should comment. So it's mind, body, spirit, and soul. When we say the phenomenological outlook, in a sense, it's like four selves within you are doing the outlook upon the world. Phenomenologia, the looking out perceptively, but not just that, looking upon the world, outlook, that dynamic, It means my body has a world connection. My spirit has a worldly tie. My mind has a worldly connection to the all, and my soul. And to varying, so it sort of goes like to varying degrees, which one comes more to the fore and which one leans back. So say when you're tennis and you're on a global stage and you're really the tennis player, it has a bit of mind because you're not a robot, but it's more being athletic. It's primarily the body part of the body of the fourfold is more to the fore. Fitness, sweating, agility, etc., etc. There's a bit of mind, really. But if you're a professor sitting at the University of Cambridge, and we want Cambridge, you wouldn't be as athletic as some player whose name escapes me. So when we pronounce this word self, self, you're really referring to, and higher powers or higher entities like angels and that would refer to it in this manner, that you compose one single whole. And to be whole, whole, like a whole entity in a sense, when you are a being, human being. So as being, you must be a whole of some sort, meaning an individual, coming from the Latin individuum, that sense of whole. It's got boundaries and it's demarcated, so it's distinctly Joe or Smith. But within its bounds, it must have integration. So there is psychical integration, mental integration, physiognomic integration, and affective or emotional, affective integration. Those registers, the whole four, like the four bodies, they just don't relate to each other. They don't simply relate to each other. They actually have to be integrated.
Right.
So, for example, if they have the four, I don't say my finger did the work. This finger, the third finger, is my hand. The hand is me, is self. Yet it has a separate, individual, distinct finger. So here is spirit. It's separate, individual, but it forges the self. So in science and in metaphysics, we talk about parts and whole. And the whole is composed by the parts, but no part is synonymous with the whole. And the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Read Aristotle 101.
Today, for instance, someone is, going back to the social media example, they are draped in it, they're lost in the ocean, they're overstimulated. How do they recalibrate? How do they get out of that?
So there's an argument that Freud picks up on, and it's a very ancient, it has nothing to do with Freud in Vienna, but he marshals it and then makes something of it. It's a sort of philosophy of mind, and they end up naming it as psychoanalysis. But it's very ancient, and it goes back to the ancient Sanskrit, the ancient Aryans that would forge later, before the Indians, is Hindus. And back to Persia and Egypt, that the ordering principle, the potency, like they talked about God's potencies. So the potency in the fourfoldness, that all these are not necessarily egalitarianly equal or flat. We're not talking about value, and we're not talking about making a judgment, but in their elemental constitution. So body, is it higher, for instance, than mind? Is mind higher than body? In terms of both capacity and extension. So capacity implies ability. Extension means something like spread. What's spread? Tennis playing, athleticism, is that useful in the kitchen when you're cooking with your wife? Well, really? Or for the BBC reader. The BBC reader may have to be linguistically adroit. So it has something to do with mechanism, physiology, probably more with acculturation, education, linguistifying. So what happens is that they all move up and down the ladder and they interchange position according to circumstance, which means what? You might ask, like what? Circumstance means space or place, and time, when. At this moment, let this one be higher. In this place, when I go to my in-laws' place, I'm going to be more quiet and shut up because I really don't like my in-laws. So we call that circumstantial prudence. Prudence by the circumstance in the situ, from Latin. Situation is from Latin situ. Right here, right now. So they fluctuate. However, there is a philosophy of mind with those ancients, Egyptians and Indians, that says what is allowing them to, do they just spontaneously decide to rearrange themselves? And mostly it falls on the side, the arguments all and the experiences fall on the side that this is not random, haphazard, and the body basically is incapable of it. Molecular bits, which we call atoms, because molecules are made up of atoms, and atoms consist of protons and electrons, essentially, right? They can't really do the A, discernibility, and B, the decisionism, the deciding. So it's mostly considered thematic, which means of the four, I mentioned soul. Soul has the highest potency and the highest range. It's in cahoots with the other elements, but the other elements are more in the command of thumos, so that they don't apportion themselves like 25%, 25%, 25%. It's not that clean and lean. So remember, according to here and now, like here, space, and now, time, yes, but what is the logos, like what is the wisdom that says, in this moment, I am to be more physical. In this moment, the body, physiology, is now to marshal forward, and let's empower that more. So, for example, when you go to sleep at night, you rest the brain mentally. So that other finger, mind, just completely goes there right down from 100%, let's say. You might go down to, not even 1%. But physiology, all the organs are going through cleansing and regenerating overnight. Culture takes a step back. Culture is somewhere between sort of spirit and mind in a way. So you don't acculturate anything at night. You say, but I dream, and that's made up of the world stuff, etc. But that's more to do with the brain and memory, etc. So there's like scaling up, low. It's like this is you all the time, every millisecond. It's in Buddhistic science that the cells, you're going like that all the while. But the registers of those apexes and troughs and all that, that sort of registers somewhere. And we say it registers where? Well, it registers in nous, which is the grand mind up above. But within the self, within a self, it is the soul. It retains that database and then keeps it, holds it in the database, the hypothalamus. And not the hippocampus, but the hypothalamus. And that, because that's cogito, cognition, awareness, daylight, light, etc. And then it says, for next time, once again, Robert, this is what you will do. And so Hume and others, really argued most of behavior, most of the time, is mostly, see those three, most? I said three most. Most of behavior, most of the time, is memorialized, and you're acting from, because we free the neurons, about 98, 99% of the neurons are freed from working, so that life is light, even though it feels heavy, it's light, right? Why? Because every time you go to reach out for a cuppa and make a cup of tea, there are a billion signals involved. You don't need to redo those and reinitiate again those billion neural processes and signals and commands and so on and so on. So you work off memory. I've done this before. And so you're really mostly operating on auto neural and synaptical robotic memorizing and reactivating. Creation, therefore, doing something novel, we call it novel. Novelty is a very small, rare proportion. So Thumos keeps a record of all that. It tells the mind, you don't have to do this again and again. So when you get into the car, all the bits are familiar to you, and you have the feel for pedals and things, because every time you're not starting afresh every single time. Most of driving, most of eating, how to use your tongue and your teeth, is 99.89% habitual. And stored information.
And that habituation, in a sense, is freeing us up for something higher.
So because we're in liminal form, we're not infinite entities called gods. So we call them gods because they're non-limited. Originally, that's where the meaning went. It didn't come from holy. It meant that they don't have any animal nature in them, whereas we do. So they are more divas. It comes from the word diva. And so to feel light and endlessly capacitated with capacity, which is a godlike feeling, we set action of the body called behavior. Behavior is merely action or energy, action by having limbs, elements, committing the action through the energy. And that is motor, automotor function, some coordination, and we flip a few neurons across the basal ganglia to produce coordinative, basically pulses, electrical pulses to the various parts. And you don't want to have to think when you raise any member, corporal member, you don't want to think. It just does it. Mm-hmm. So you then allow space, neural space, to think about the poem that you'll write that is better than, Thompson or someone. So the rarity of that free space is holy in the sense that it is of divine nature. It is not of human or to human nature. Human or to human is to be repetitive. The unthinking thinking animal. The unthinking thinking animal. It's the creatorial within you. But the creator within you is that little special percentile range kept up there, reserved. And so why does everyone want to travel? Why is tourism popular? Because you seek, you lust after that divine little margin, niche of neurons and synapses that is of God nature for the novel. You want to be shocked and get off the hypothalamus bandwagon, because in Nigeria I saw a waterfall and it breaks my patterns, and so again you want to do it, and again. You're actually killing novelty by traveling more, and that's the dialectical move. Don't do too much if you want to lust and love the desire to desire. You love to desire, not you desire. You love to desire, so you desire to desire. That's the basis of tourism 101. So the thicker and denser we are in all sorts of manners, I say that. Denser in a sort of atomic sense, energetic atomic sense, 2. The more you distantiate, you place a greater separable distance between self and world, self and others, self and phenomena. But it's imminent and you have no choice. Because you are a creature, you are created, you are created as thus necessarily. Just like you had no choice to be birthed by molecules. Like, did you come into this world and say, oh, I will not have molecules? No. You are here because you are necessarily molecular. So you are here because you are necessarily thematic.
So thumos, soul, runs with truth hand in hand.
Truth is in the world because, again, truth is, aletheia is ubiquitous. But because of density, as it comes down lower and descends, and when it descends onto the planet, I don't mean in raw nature, physis, when it becomes cultural, so cultural is a working of or working over of and a fabrication of nature. So it grabs physis, yeah, and like when you do astrophysics, you marshal it and then you make maths or you make theorems and you make proofs. So that's physics. That would be culture. There will inevitably be distortion. Morally, it would be inevitably deceit, deception, and the flip, distrust, suspicion, skepticism. So therein, even in the mafia, right, they are dealing with truth, the mafia bosses. The FBI, it's still, are we or are we not being attacked? Are we now full of double agents or are we not? So even in the corner in any sort of corner that you least expect it because of its ubiquity quality, truth inevitably hovers. But in an information age of skepticism, deep distrust, etc., we don't understand its ubiquitous nature. We think we're quite extreme. We think that it's a dead loss. Like it's all, nihilistically, we just judge it to be hopeless. Everything and everything, your phones, any source, Google, they're all corrupt. They're all pervert. They're all romance is stuffed up, is punctuated with selfishness. And you just become despondent and more depressed and resignatory. Now, that itself is a truth statement. So even in the most affective emotional states that are deeply down and depressed, there is truth about that. I am too depressed. We are all too skeptical. They're all bits of truth. Even as you are shunning truth, you're still in truth.